Hi, I'm Rose from Mellow Yarns Crochet. If you're new here, welcome to my channel. And if you're returning, welcome back. I'm so happy to have you here. Today I'm going to be reviewing this crochet kit from Kmart. I've heard some real horror stories about the other crochet kits from Kmart, particularly the dinosaur and the koala crochet kits. Apparently the patterns just evolve into complete nonsense halfway through and are completely unusable. However, they are often sold out at my local Kmart, so I suspect that they are quite popular. The last time I was there, I saw this little pea pod kit, which I hadn't seen before, and I thought it looked quite cute. So I figured I'd give it a shot to see if it turns out any better than the other crochet kits. So keep watching to find out if I can successfully make a cute little pea pod from this crochet kit, or if it'll be a complete bust. Okay, let's open her up. So according to the back here, we'll get 4 coloured yarns, 1 crochet hook, a plastic needle, a ring stitch marker, some fibre fill, and 1 instruction set. This is the image on the front. Here's our little instructions. And a polyfill. A needle and stitch marker. Some green yarn. Yellow yarn. And a teeny little bit of pink yarn. Actually, a little, even smaller amount of black yarn. Now this is the crochet hook. This is a very unusual crochet hook. I'm not quite sure how this will feel to crochet with. It's not a very comfortable handle. It is metal though, which is good. And it's got the 2 different crochet sizes on it. So there's a size 4 on this end and a size 3 on the other end. So let's have a look at these instructions. They're quite detailed instructions. They have little photographs, which is great. And they start by explaining what a slip knot is, how to do a chain stitch, a slip stitch, single crochet, increases, decreases, double crochets, fastening off, and sewing up. So at first glance they seem decent instructions. They also explain how to do a magic ring, weaving in and invisible closes, and then the actual instructions for the pea itself are actually quite simple. Now with this yarn, it is very soft, but I can tell it's not very good quality. The end here is already split into each of its individual strands, which suggests it's probably going to be quite a splitty yarn and probably quite frustrating to work with. But it is soft, it does feel quite nice. It doesn't feel overly plasticky. Yeah, this is kind of splitting on the yellow yarn there as well. One thing I do think is actually a little misleading is on the picture here they have an image of the green yarn already stitched into a magic loop, and I wondered if this meant that the yarn would actually come with the magic loop pre-stitched, as this is something that the Woobles kits does, because the magic circle can be quite tricky if you've never crocheted before, so they kind of skip the difficult step by doing that bit for you. And when I saw this picture here, I wondered if this kit was going to do the same thing, but clearly not. The green yarn doesn't have any circle pre-stitched into it. Okay, so let's start with the pea pod. They say round 1, chain 27, insert your hook into second round, back knots, increase 24. Okay, this is already a bit confusing. I'm not sure what they mean by back knots, and they don't seem to explain what they mean by back knots. They have a little guide here, but there's no reference to back knot, so I don't know if that means back loop only. Oh, maybe actually that means the back bumps of the chain. That would make sense. I've just never heard it referred to as back knots before. And I think if this is a kit for beginners, as is implied by these instructions, then that wouldn't be intuitive to a beginner either. It's also slightly confusing that they've merged the kind of starting chain row with row 1. It kind of just goes straight into that row still calling it row 1, which is not that common. But yeah, let's give it a go. So it also doesn't tell me which size hook to use, even though this crochet hook has the 2 ends. Let's go with the 4. It's not comfortable in my hands, but it's not overly rough. It's not actually catching on the yarn, which is good. Okay, so I'm going to do 1 increase in the second loop from my hook. Yeah, this yarn's already starting to split on me. 1 increase and then 24 single crochets. And what I assume is the back bumps. Yarn is definitely quite splitty. It's also quite slippery. So it's not getting caught on my hook, but it's yeah, just a little bit hard to wrangle. Very, very slippy. So now it's telling me to do 4 single crochets in the final stitch. And then 24 more single crochets, which is presumably in the other side of the chain. But this is something I think that's not particularly intuitive, particularly for new crocheters, that you're expected to do 24 stitches now along the back side of the starting chain. So I think that definitely could have been explained a little bit more clearly. This yarn and hook combination is definitely very slow going. Okay, now for rounds 2 to 5, it's saying 56 single crochets. So presumably again we're kind of working around the outside. So I'll use this stitch marker here to mark the start of the round, which again they don't suggest doing, or they don't tell you to do that in the pattern, which I think would be a good addition for new crocheters. Okay, so the final row of the little pea pod here is 52 slip stitches. Now I hadn't really been referring to these instructions for all the stitches in the little instruction manual because I know how to do all of these stitches. But now that I've actually looked at them, they are hilariously bad. So the slip stitch instructions, just hold it up there. The slip stitch is the flattest and smallest of all crochet stitches. You can stitch this stitch by slip stitching the ends of a foundation chain to form a ring. So firstly, You can't describe how to do a slip stitch by, say, slip stitching. If I knew what slip stitching was, I wouldn't be reading this section of the instructions. But also, using a slip stitch to join a foundation chain together is one way to use a slip stitch. It's not the only way. And actually in this pattern, it wants me to do 52 slip stitches into the top of my pea pod. Now, if I was new and I didn't understand what a slip stitch was, I'd be very confused about how I'm supposed to do 52 slip stitches when the description of a slip stitch only talks about turning a foundation chain into a loop. Okay, so I finished making the pea pod. Still just need to weave in the ends. But the yarn's actually not terrible. It's got quite a nice feel to it, which I guess is less important for amigurumi. But if you're going to give it as a toy for a child, it's nice that it has a nice feel to it. And it's pretty decent stitch definition as well. Like I said earlier, it is definitely very splitty, so that is quite frustrating to work with. But apart from the splittiness, it's actually not a terrible yarn. Okay, so the next element to make are the two little peas that sit inside the pea pod. It's just occurred to me, I'm not quite sure why the peas are yellow. I don't know if they're meant to be corn, I think they're meant to be peas. So I'm not quite sure why they're yellow. So the instruction for making the peas are to start with 6 single crochets, which is pretty confusing if you're a new beginner. I presume that those single crochets are to be worked into a magic ring. But they don't actually say that, they just say 6 single crochets. Assuming you do figure that out, that you need to start with the magic ring, the instructions for a magic ring are not at all helpful. So they say, when crocheting round shape, make 1 magic ring first and then crochet from the center. If you knew what a magic ring was, then you wouldn't be reading this section of the pattern, and it doesn't actually tell you how to make the magic ring at all. So the other thing I'll note as well is this double-ended crochet hook. I find that I keep accidentally using the wrong end when I start my next round, which again can be a little bit confusing. You definitely need to make sure that you remembered which size hook you were using. So usually at this point is when I would embroider on the face details, but the pattern doesn't actually suggest doing it until the end, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It's going to be much harder to embroider the face onto the peas when it's stuffed and full of polyfill. But true to the experiment, I will do it as the pattern says and wait until the pea is completely finished before I sew the face onto it. However, for the second pea, I'll do it the way that I would typically do it, just to see how differently it turns out. So the pattern doesn't actually tell me to weave in my ends, but I know that if I don't weave in this end, then magic loop will come undone. And that it makes sense to do that before you fill it with polyfill. So this plastic needle they give you is pretty terrible. I wouldn't have really expected a metal needle in a $6 kit like this. But what's particularly annoying is the head here is really wide. It's much wider than any one of my individual stitches. So it's really hard to pull through when you're weaving in the ends without really pulling your stitches quite loose. Okay, there's my final pea. It looks alright on the side. It's a little bit messy where the yarn split a couple of times while I was working with it. The bottom side though looks very messy, and this is, might be I've stuffed the pea a little bit too much, but I think it's mainly because they don't recommend using invisible decreases. They just have standard decreases, which is what I've done, but it's making some quite large holes in the bottom here. I'm guessing that probably doesn't matter too much though, because the little pea will be in the pot anyway and you won't see this backside. Okay, now I'm going to embroider the face. The instructions are even less helpful with embroidering. They just tell you to please sew all the parts. Whereas typically normally for an amigurumi pattern, they'll generally tell you how to embroider the face, like for example what rows to start the eyes on, for example, but this doesn't really give any instructions or even really any photographs of what to do. I'm not even going to bother with the plastic yarn because I know that that's going to be a nightmare, so I'll use one of my metal needles instead. Now the other thing that I think is slightly misleading is on the photograph here, they've clearly sewn this on with embroidery thread. It's much finer than the yarn that the pea is made with, but actually what's included in the pack is more yarn of the same weight. So typically when I'm embroidering I go in from the back, but because the pattern hasn't told me to embroider the face until I've already stuffed the pea, it's going to be a little bit tricky, but let's just go in from the bottom here. I also just realised on the pattern picture, they seem to actually have the faces stitched into the side of the pea rather than the top. However, because this bottom side looks so messy, I think really I need to put the face on the top so that the messy part of the pea is hidden. There we go, first little pea in his pod. Okay, so now the last piece to make is the little bow. There's 3 chain, 3 double crochet, 3 chain split stitch times 2. So I'm a bit confused by this pattern. It says 3 chain, 3 DC, 3 chain, which I've done slip stitch, which I've done on the left hand side, and then do that twice. But I'm not quite sure where I'm supposed to slip stitch into now. I could go back to the first stitch, but then I don't really have a bow shape. And it says make 1 slip stitch at the bottom of the bow knots on both sides to bring the 2 sides together and wind twice at the junction. I don't really know what that means. Not really sure if I followed that correctly or not, and it's not the prettiest looking bow, but it's kind of bow-like. Okay, so I've finished making the kit. Although I say finished, I wasn't actually able to finish the second pea seed here because I ran out of yarn, which is really frustrating. I probably had too much of an initial tail at the start of this one, but even so, I wouldn't have had enough to finish off this pea pod. I was probably about halfway through the pattern when I ran out of yarn. Maybe if I'd used the smaller end of the crochet hook, I might have been a little bit tighter. I might have been able to make it. But when you buy a kit like this, it's a bit frustrating that there's not a little bit more leeway to have enough yarn to finish the pattern. So ignoring the pea pod that I didn't finish, here's the final version. It's actually turned out cuter than I was expecting. And the yarn actually feels quite nice, which would be quite good, I think, if you were going to give this as a toy. It does have quite a nice soft feel to it. And it's not terrible stitch definition either. I will say though about the yarn, it was very splitty. It split a lot while I was crocheting with it, which got really frustrating and quite tedious. The other thing that I didn't actually notice at the time, but I saw another YouTuber, Strawberry and Stitches, has done a review of one of the other Kmart crochet kits, so I'll link that in the description. That's the koala and dinosaur kits that she has reviewed, and she noticed that the crochet hook here actually is quite a bit smaller than the size that it says. So this is meant to be a 4mm and a 3mm, so I thought I'd check that myself as well. Here's my 4mm clover more, and you can see here the Kmart hook is quite a bit skinnier than a 4mm hook. So I'm not really sure what size this is. I suspect it's probably a 3, and the other end here probably closer to a 2. But yeah, that's not really ideal either, because again, if you're starting out in crochet, you might want to use this hook again, and if you try and use this hook for a pattern that calls for a 4mm hook, your gauge is going to be way off. I actually found it not as annoying to use as I thought it would with this flat base. Usually I use an ergonomic hook like the clover, so I thought I'd find this really irritating. But actually I found I got used to it and it wasn't too hard to crochet with. But I suspect that's because of how I like to hold my hook. I imagine for people that have a slightly different hold that this style of hook could be quite annoying to use. Also, it wasn't the most comfortable crochet hook to use, and I think it would get quite painful over time because the other end of the crochet hook kind of rests here when you're crocheting, and this isn't very comfortable either. It was smoother than I was expecting though. Given it was such an inexpensive kit, I suspected the crochet hook would be really rough and that it would catch on the yarn, but actually it's very smooth. If anything, it's probably a little too smooth and a little too slippery, especially with this yarn. So in coming back to the yarn, like I said, the final product is actually quite nice, I think. It feels nice, it's got good stitch definition, definitely doesn't feel overly plasticky like some acrylic yarns can, but it was incredibly splitty. You can see here the threads just come apart very easily. So that's really frustrating to crochet with. And again, I think if you were a new crocheter, you'd probably think that the issue is your technique, when actually this yarn is just very difficult to crochet with without accidentally splitting the yarn. So I found another YouTuber that reviewed some of the other Anko crochet kits. She reviewed the koala and also the dinosaur. And she's actually rewritten the pattern for the dinosaur in a way that makes sense. So if you are interested in doing one of these kits, I'll include a link to her channel in the description below, and I definitely recommend you checking out her pattern for the dinosaur, which will be much easier to follow than the pattern that's included in the kit. So overall, my impression of this kit is, I think it's not at all beginner friendly. The instructions I was able to follow. I did wonder if this pattern would be completely nonsensical based on what I've heard about some of the other kits, but that wasn't the case. I could follow the pattern, but I think I would definitely find it confusing if I hadn't done crochet or amigurumi before, because there are things that just aren't explained or said explicitly, like for example that you should start with the magic ring. These additional instructions that they have for how to do stitches, initially I thought was quite good. There's quite a lot of them, they're detailed, they have photographs, but actually when you read them you realise that they don't really make any sense. The instructions for the slip stitch and also for the magic ring just say make a magic ring. They don't actually explain how to do the stitch at all. So definitely I think you wouldn't be able to pick this up as your first crochet project and make sense of it. I think you'd need to watch some tutorial videos to really be able to follow this pattern. So I think it's a real shame that this kit is not very beginner friendly, because I think kits are such a great option for new crocheters, because if you don't already have your own set of crochet hooks, you don't have a lot of yarn already stashed, then a kit is a really cheap and easy way to get everything you need to make a project from start to finish. So I think it's a real shame that the instructions for this kit don't really make it suitable for beginners at all. It's probably only really suitable for someone that has a bit of amigurumi experience under their belt already, and in that case I don't think you would really want the crochet hook or the needle, because they're not very good quality and you've probably got a better one yourself already. So one circumstance that I think this kit could be good for would be as if you're wanting to teach someone else how to crochet. So for example, you want to teach your child how to crochet, because then you've got all the equipment you need for $6, it's very cheap, and as long as you're an experienced crocheter yourself, then the fact that the pattern doesn't make a lot of sense won't matter, because you'll be able to guide them through it. And the other circumstance where it might be useful is, again, if you're an experienced crocheter, you want to make the item. Do find with amigurumi often you only really need small quantities of yarn in the right colour, and if you don't already have a large stash of amigurumi yarn, it can be annoying having to buy full-size balls when you only really need a small amount. So I think these kits could be good for that as well, although from what I've heard it does seem like some of the other kits, the patterns actually completely stop making sense and you wouldn't be able to follow it even if you were an experienced crocheter. So I definitely buy the kit with that word of warning. So overall, would I buy this kit again? Probably not. Again, if I was going to teach a child how to crochet, I think it could be quite a nice fun project, and at least for this pattern, the pattern was followable, even if it wasn't completely well explained for a beginner crocheter. So that's all I have for this kit review. I hope you found the video useful and interesting. If you've used these kits yourself, please let me know in the comments what your experience was like. And if there's any other kits that you've seen out there that you'd like me to review, let me know in the comments. If you liked the video, be sure to like and subscribe for more info and inspo for crochet makers. I hope you've had a great afternoon crocheting with me, and happy crafting!